you don't choose your passions choose you. And all of us are gifted with certain passions, and the people who are lucky are the ones who get to follow those things. And I always advise our young employees, I meet with interns and so on, you can have, and my kids too, you can have a job, or you can have a career, or you can have a calling. And if you can somehow figure out how to have a calling, you have hit the jackpot, because that's the big deal. And most people don't ever get there. You know, you're very lucky if you have a career. A lot of people end up with a job. Do something that you think is interesting, and let the waves catch you. You know, something that I see people do, which I don't think is a good idea, is they try to chase the current thing. I saw this so much in 1997 and 1998, 1999 with respect to the internet. There were, you know, in 94 and 95 and 96 and 97, mostly the people who were, you know, the kind of the earlier you get, the more true this is, but, you know, the people who were sort of looking at this space and starting companies were genuinely interested in it. They thought it was really cool. By the time you got to 1999, like doctors were stopping, you know, like, screw that doctor thing. I'm going to start a .com company. You know, and so that really made no sense whatsoever. You know, people were sort of abandoning the things they were genuinely interested in, trying to catch a wave. And whenever you try to catch a wave, you're almost always too late. So it's better to just, I mean, if you're paddling after it, you basically have to wait in place and let it come to you. And so just find something that you're passionate about. I would definitely, on the career advice side, the most important thing about your first job out of school is to pick a place where you think where your learning per unit time is going to be very high. You can optimize for a bunch of variables, and it can get very confusing. You know, where is the location? You know, what's the salary going to be? And all those things are worth considering. They're all important. But make sure you pull back after you've done your analysis and say, am I also picking the place that I believe my learning per unit time is going to be the fastest? And you learn much more from a best practices company than you do. You learn no matter where you go. So if you go work for somebody, you're like, God, these people are all crazy. This is insane. You'll learn a lot of negative lessons that you can use later, and you can not do those things. But that process of elimination method takes a long time. So it's better to try and find a place that has really high hiring standards. Some of the basics, especially, you know, a place that's trying to recruit only the A's hire A's, and B's hire C's, and C's hire D's. So you've got to hire only A's, and you need to pick a company that's doing those kinds of fundamental practices well, because then you'll learn so much. It'll set you up to do other things. So I would say that's probably the best career advice I give. A young person should find something that they're passionate about to do. And that's not going to surprise anyone. It's a clear thing to do. It's very hard. If you don't love your work, you're never going to be great at it. I think the other thing I would suggest to any young person, even before they start their career, is to really think about their choices. Because I find young people, and when I was young, I made this mistake too. You can get very fixed on your gifts. So everybody has gifts. You know, you have gifts and you have things that you didn't get gifted. Maybe you're extremely beautiful. Maybe you're extremely good at mathematics. Maybe there are a lot of things that you can be given. But those things can confuse you because they're not the things that construct your life. It's your choices that construct your life, not your gifts. You can celebrate your gifts. Be proud of them. Be happy of them. Actually, don't be proud of them. Be celebratory of them. But you can't be proud because they're gifts. They were given to you. You didn't earn them. You can only be proud of the things you earn. And so as I got older, I started to realize I wasn't proud of my gifts. I was always good at school. School was always easy for me. And I was always proud that I was a great student. I got A's in all my classes. I was good at math, all of that. And I thought that's who I was. But it's not true. Those are the things that are gifts. What was hard for me is deciding to work hard, deciding to use my gifts in certain ways, to challenge myself, to do things that I didn't think I could do, to put myself in uncomfortable situations. We all get, I would say to a young person, you can choose a life of ease and comfort, or you can choose a life of service and adventure. Which one of those, when you're 90 years old, are you going to be more proud of? My grandparents belonged to a caravan club, a group of Airstream trailer owners who traveled together around the US and Canada. And every few summers, we'd join the caravan. On one particular trip, I was about 10 years old. I was rolling around in the big bench seat in the back of the car. My grandfather was driving, and my grandmother had the passenger seat. She smoked throughout these trips, and I hated the smell. I'd been hearing an ad campaign about smoking. I can't remember the details, but basically the ad said, every puff of a cigarette takes some number of minutes off of your life. I think it might have been 2 minutes per puff. At any rate, I decided to do the math for my grandmother. I estimated the number of cigarettes per day, estimated the number of puffs per cigarette, and so on. When I was satisfied that I'd come up with a reasonable number, I poked my head into the front of the car, tapped my grandmother on the shoulder, and proudly proclaimed, "At 2 minutes per puff, you've taken 9 years off of your life." I have a very vivid memory of what happened next, and it was not what I had expected. My grandmother burst into tears. I sat in the back seat, didn't know what to do, while my grandmother was crying. My grandfather, who'd been driving in silence, pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway. He got out of the car and came around and opened my door and waited for me to follow. We stopped beside the trailer. My grandfather looked at me, and after a bit of silence, he gently and calmly said, "Jeff, one day you'll understand that it's harder to be kind than clever." What I want to talk to you about today is the difference between gifts and choices. Cleverness is a gift. Kindness is a choice. Gifts are easy. They're given, after all. Choices can be hard. As a civilization, we will have so many gifts, just as you as individuals have so many individual gifts as you sit before me. How will you use these gifts? And will you take pride in your gifts or pride in your choices? How will you use your gifts? What choices will you make? Will inertia be your guide, or will you follow your passions? Will you follow dogma, or will you be original? Will you choose a life of ease, or a life of service and adventure? Will you wilt under criticism, or will you follow your convictions? Will you bluff it out when you're wrong, or will you apologize? Will you guard your heart against rejection, or will you act when you fall in love? Will you play it safe, or will you be a little bit swashbuckling? When it's tough, will you give up, or will you be relentless? Will you be a cynic, or will you be a builder? Will you be clever at the expense of others, or will you be kind? I will hazard a prediction. When you are 80 years old, and in a quiet moment of reflection, narrating for only yourself the most personal version of your life story. The telling that will be most compact and meaningful will be the series of choices you have made. In the end, we are our choices. Build yourself a great story.
How do you go about establishing that work-life balance that everybody, talks about and thinks about? You live a big life, right? And how do you
I get this
balance
question
it?
a lot. I get it. I teach senior executive kind of leadership classes at Amazon for our most senior execs, and I also teach, or not teach, but I also speak to interns, so kind of all across the spectrum. And I get this question about work-life balance all the time from both ends of the spectrum. And my view is I don't even like the phrase work-life balance. I think it's misleading. I like the phrase work-life harmony, because I know that if I am energized at work, happy at work, feeling like I'm adding value, part of a team, whatever energizes you, that makes me better at home. It makes me a better husband, a better father, and likewise, if I'm happy at home, it makes me a better employee, a better boss, all the things. It's not primarily about, there may be crunch periods where it's about the number of hours in the week, but that's not the real thing. Usually it's about, do you have energy? And is your work depriving you of energy, or is your work generating energy for you? And there are people, everybody in this room knows people who fall into these two camps. You're in a meeting, and the person comes in the room. Some people come into the meeting, and they add energy to the meeting. Other people come into the meeting, and the whole meeting just deflates. And those people they drain energy from the meeting. And you have to decide which of those kinds of people you're going to be. Are you going to add energy?
And the same thing at home.
And the same thing at home. And it's a wheel, it's a cycle, it's a flywheel, it's a circle. It's not a balance. Because a balance, that's why that metaphor is so dangerous, because it implies there's a strict trade-off. And you could be out of work, have all the time for your family in the world, but really depressed and demoralized about your work situation, and your family wouldn't want to be anywhere near you. They would wish you would take a vacation from them. And so it's not about the number of hours, not primarily. I suppose if you went crazy with 100 hours a week or something, yeah, that maybe there are limits, and they probably. But I've never had a problem, and I think it's because both sides of my life give me energy, and that's what I would recommend. And that's what I do recommend to interns and execs.
If you're happy at work, if you're finding meaning in your work, if you are. It can be hard. They call it work for a reason. It's not going to be fun all the time. That's a pipe dream. None of us enjoys every minute of every day. And to have that kind of idea would just be naive. But there should be fun at work. You should be laughing. There should be moments of joy. And if you're getting energy from work, instead of your work draining your energy, then you're going to come home and you're going to be a better mother, a better father, a better wife, a better husband, all of those things. I think if you're starting to get to the point where you are worried about work-life balance, I would challenge you to think, is just something out of whack? It's probably not the hours. Look, if you're working 120 hours a week, you're also doing something wrong. That's too much. It's not sustainable. Maybe you can do that for a week or two, but that's it. But if you're working, 60 hours a week, that's completely sustainable for most people. And if you're burned out by it, it's not the number of hours. It's that you're doing something wrong. You need to figure out what it is, because you're going to take that home, and then your home life is going to be stressful, and then you're going to bring that back into the office. So it's going to be a negative spiral, and that spiral will also be a positive one as soon as you turn it around.
You can choose. We all get to choose our life stories, and it's the choices that define us, not our gifts. Everybody in this room has many gifts. I have many gifts. You can never be proud of your gifts because they're gifts. They were given to you. You might be, tall, or you might be really good at math, or you might be extremely beautiful or handsome, or, there are many gifts. And you can only be proud really of your choices because those are the things that you are acting on. And one of the most important choices that each of us has, and you know this just as well as I do, is you can choose a life of ease and comfort, or you can choose a life of service and adventure. And when you're 80, which one of those things do you think you're going to be more proud of? You're going to be more proud of having chosen a life of service and adventure. If you want to be an inventor of any kind, inventing a new service offering for customers or a new product or anything, being an inventor requires, because the world is so complicated, you have to be a domain expert. I mean, in a way, even if you're not at the beginning, you have to learn enough so that you become a domain expert. But the danger is once you've become a domain expert, you can be trapped by that knowledge. And so inventors have this paradoxical ability to have that 10,000 hours of practice and be a real domain expert and have that beginner's mind. Have that look at it freshly even though they know so much about the domain. And that's the key to inventing. You have to have both. And I think that is intentional. I think all of us have that inside of us, and we can all do it, but you have to be intentional about it. You have to say, yeah, I am going to become an expert, and I'm going to keep my beginner's mind.
So one of the things I want to talk about, a question that we've talked about before, you were 30 years old in 1994 when you decided to start Amazon.com. You had a great job. How did you go through making the decision to drop what was a very good job and take this chance? It all seems very obvious now, right? This many years later that it paid off, but at the time it was not obvious.
No, it wasn't. And I did do a lot of soul searching. I went to my boss at the time, and I really liked my job. And I told my boss I was going to go do this thing, start an internet bookstore, and my wife I'd already told my wife, and she's like, great, let's go. And I said to my boss, I was going to do this. He's like, this is a good idea. He said, I think this is a good idea, but it would be an even better idea for somebody who didn't already have a good job. And that sort of made some logical sense to me, and he convinced me to think about it for a couple of days, so I went away, and I was really trying to get my head around how to think about this. And I think, for me, the right way to make that kind of very personal decision, because those decisions are personal. They're not like data-driven business decisions. They are, what does your heart say? And for me, the best way to think about it was to project myself forward to age 80 and say, look, when I'm 80 years old, I want to have minimized the number of regrets that I have. I don't want to be 80 years old in a quiet moment of reflection, thinking back over my life and cataloging a bunch of major regrets. And I think that regrets, our biggest regrets, in most cases, you can murder somebody, okay, you'd regret that. But in most cases, our biggest regrets turn out to be acts of omission. It's paths not taken, and they haunt us. We wonder, what would have happened? I loved that person, and I never told them. And then they married somebody else. I didn't do this. And so that's the frame of mind that I put myself in. And once I did that, once I thought about it that way, it was immediately obvious to me. I knew that when I'm 80, I would never regret trying this thing that I was super excited about and it failing. If it failed, fine. I would be very proud of the fact when I'm 80 that I tried. And I also knew that it would always haunt me if I didn't try. And so that would be a regret. It would be a 100% chance of a regret if I didn't try, and basically a 0% chance of regret if I tried and failed. So I think that's a useful metric for any important life decision. Well, long-term thinking is a lever. It lets you do things that you could not do or couldn't even conceive of doing if you were thinking short-term. So if that's why, I have a project where I'm helping a group of people build a 10,000-year clock. It kind of ticks once a year and dongs once a century, and the cuckoo comes out once a millennium. It's a big 500-foot tall thing inside a mountain right here.
Inside one of those mountains.
This mountain range. And the 10,000-year clock is a symbol. I don't think it'll do anything for the first few hundred years. But after a few hundred years, once it's old, people start to pay attention to older symbols. And so a few hundred years from now, I hope that people will think about that as a symbol for long-term thinking. If I collaborated with somebody here in this audience and I said, look, I want you to solve world hunger, and I want you to do it in 5 years, you would properly reject the opportunity. You would say, look, it's not possible, it's not practical. But if I said, look, I want you to solve world hunger in 100 years, that's a job you'd take, because it's a much more addressable problem. You can first create the conditions. You have time to create the conditions where then you can solve the problem. And so that's a very important way of thinking, and I find, and it works with everything. I mean, you have to back up and find the right time horizon for what you're trying to do. But at Amazon, we probably do most of our things. We expect to get some results in sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 years. But we find a lot of our other companies that compete against us in various ways, they're often trying to get things done in 2 or 3 years. And so we can do things that, if everything has to work in 2 to 3 years, then that limits what you can do. If you give yourself the breathing room to say, okay, I'm okay if it takes 7 years, all of a sudden you have way more opportunities.
I often tell people that I work with, if you can get, because people have very high standards for how they want their work life to be. And I said, look, if you can get your work life to be where you enjoy half of it, that is amazing. Because very few people ever achieve that. Because the truth is, everything comes with overhead. That's reality. Everything comes with pieces that you don't like. You could be a Supreme Court justice, and there's still going to be pieces of your job you don't like. You can be a university professor, and still going to be, you have to go to committee meetings, and you have to do things. Every job comes with pieces you don't like. And we need to say, that's part of it. And not resent those pieces, or try not to, but also try to minimize them. I tell senior executives, you should have the least stress. There's this weird, I think, false idea that CEOs, I'm a CEO, there's this false idea that CEOs are under the most stress. Well, I look at that, I'm like, why? You're in charge. Why don't you delegate the stress? It's your choice. And so you have to figure out how to set up your life in such a way that you can minimize the things. And I find people don't dislike hard work. What people dislike is being out of control. Like, they can't control their life. They can't control their environment. This happens to me when I get overscheduled. I hate being overscheduled. I want some time to be able to think and free myself. We all have the same amount of time in the world. Nobody has more time than anybody else. And when you become a very successful person, one of the things, you start to get overscheduled. You have to guard your time and try to stay a little bit flexible. So that's, for me, it's not a waste of time, but I like to have some freedom of movement rather than having every minute of every day scheduled.